Between the 1st and 2nd of February in 1959, 9 ski hikers in the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union tragically died, despite being incredibly experienced, and the cause of their final breaths has never been explained. In 1959, the group was formed for a skiing expedition across the northern Urals in Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union. The leader was 23-year-old radio engineering student Igor Dyatlov, and most of the others were fellow students at the same university. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all of which were skilled hikers with ski tour experience and would even move up a grade upon their return, the highest certificate available in the Soviet Union, which would require them to travel 300 kilometers, which is 190 miles. They set out to reach Otorten, a mountain that is just 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles north of where this terrible incident took place. In the early hours of January the 25th, 1959, the group arrived at Ivdel, a town at the center of the northern province of Sverdlovsk Oblast. They then took a truck to Vizhai, a village that is actually the final inhabited settlement to the north. They spent the night there purchasing loaves of bread to keep their energy levels up for the hike the following day. On January the 27th, they began to trek towards Otorten, but the following day, one of the members, Yuri Yudin, gave up. He had previously suffered from several health ailments, including rheumatism and congenital heart defect. During the hike, he had knee and joint pain and felt like he couldn't continue, so the group went on without him. Despite Yudin separating and returning home, diaries and cameras found at their last campsite made it possible to still track their route up to their terrible fate. On January the 31st, they arrived at the edge of a highland area and began climbing. They did manage to get food and extra equipment for the trip back, and on February the 1st they started to move again through a pass in a wooded valley. They seemed to want to get over the pass and make camp for the next night on the other side, but the weather was getting worse. Snowstorms began and their vision was severely impaired. They lost their direction and turned west up towards the top of Kolatsiaki. They did seem to notice their mistake and decided to stop and set up camp there on the slope of the mountain rather than just moving 1.5 kilometers, just 0.93 miles downhill to a forested area which would have easily offered them a lot more shelter. Yuri Yudin assumes that Dyatlov probably just didn't want to lose the altitude they had gained, or he just wanted to practice camping on the mountain slope. Before the group had even set off, Dyatlov had agreed to send a telegram to their sports club as soon as they returned to Vizhai. It was estimated to happen by February the 12th, but when Yudin departed, he was told that it may be a lot longer. The 12th passed without any message being received, but this was quite common during expeditions, so there was no immediate panic or cause for concern. On February the 20th, with still no word, relatives demanded a rescue operation and volunteer students and teachers were sent out before being followed by the army. On February the 26th, they discovered the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kolatsiaki, but the sight they found has baffled the world to this day. The tent was half torn down and covered with snow. There was no one inside, but all of the group's belongings and even their shoes were left behind. The tent had been cut open from the inside and there were 8 or 9 sets of footprints left by people who were only wearing socks or just a single shoe, or possibly even barefoot, leading down towards the edge of some nearby woods on the opposite side of the pass. Unfortunately, after 500 meters, the tracks were covered with snow. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian pine, they also found the visible remains of a small fire. They also discovered the first 2 bodies, Yuri Alexeyevich Krivonishenko and Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko. They had no shoes on and were only dressed in their underwear. The branches on the tree were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one of the skiers had climbed up to look for something. Between the pine and the camp, they found 3 more corpses: Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, Zenaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, and Rustam Vladimirovich Slobodin. These bodies were found in specific poses to suggest that they were attempting to return to the tent. Discovering the final 4 travelers took more than 2 months. Finally being discovered on May the 4th under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters further into the woods from the aforementioned pine tree. 3 of these 4 were better dressed than the others, and there were indications that those who had died first had their clothes relinquished to the others. Dubinina was wearing Krivonchenko's burned, torn trousers, and her left foot and shin were wrapped in a torn jacket. Naturally, an inquest started immediately after the first few bodies were discovered, but there were no injuries found that may have led to their deaths, originally ruling it down to hypothermia. Slobodin had a small crack in his skull, but it wasn't thought to have been fatal or foul play. However, once the later 4 bodies were discovered, everything changed. Vladimirovich had major skull damage, and both Lyudmila Alexandrovna Dubinina and Semyon Alexeyevich Zolotaryov had major chest fractures. They concluded that the force required to cause such damage would have been extremely high, comparable to the force of a car crash. The bodies also had no external wounds associated with the bone fractures, as if they had been subjected to a high level of pressure. Furthermore, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, parts of her lips and some facial tissue, and a fragment of skull bone. She also had extensive skin maceration on her hands. It's worth noting that she was found lying face down in a small stream that ran under the snow, and this is unlikely to be associated with her cause of death. One theory was that the indigenous Mansi people had attacked and murdered the group for imposing on their land. However, it was believed that the deaths just didn't match the Mansi people. Only the hikers' footprints were visible, and there were no signs of any struggle. So let's look at the facts. The temperature was very low, around minus 25 degrees Celsius, but the dead were only partially dressed. Some of them only wore one shoe or no shoes, some only wore socks or underwear. 6 of the group members died of hypothermia and 3 of fatal injuries. There was no evidence of any other people in the area at the time. The tent had been ripped open from within. The victims died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. The group all left the campsite of their own accord. The force of the blows was far too strong to have been done by a human being, and there were no survivors. With all of this confusing evidence, it was originally concluded that there was some strong natural disaster that caused them all to flee and then pass away. The original case stopped in May of 1959. However, around the same time as this incident, another group of hikers, around 50 kilometers or 31 miles south, reported seeing strange orange spheres in the sky to the north on the same night that this incident took place. Several witnesses confirmed sightings of these spheres during these months. However, this story wasn't brought forward until years after the original investigation. In 1967, Sverdlovsk writer and journalist Yuri Yarovoy wrote a novel inspired by the whole ordeal. He was involved in the search party and the investigation that followed. The book, however, was written during the search, so he had to keep certain things quiet, and it had a more optimistic feel to the real-life events, where only one of them was found dead. Allegedly, he did have more versions of the book that weren't allowed to be published due to censorship, but he passed away in 1980, and these lost manuscripts have never seen the light of day. However, on April 12, 2018, the remains of Semyon Zolotaryov was reinvestigated. One expert claimed that his injuries resembled someone being knocked down by a car, and his DNA didn't show any living relatives. But to add confusion, the name isn't listed as any of the people buried at the Ivanovskoye cemetery. However, once they reconstructed his face, they matched some post-war photographs to Semyon, though others believe someone may have hid under his name after the war took place. For 3 years after the incident, the area was completely cut off, but it is still accessible to this day. But in February of 2019, it was announced that the Russian authorities were actually reopening the investigation 60 years later. But they only gave 3 possible explanations: an avalanche, a snow slab avalanche, or a hurricane. The possibility of foul play or any sort of crime has been completely ruled out. American skeptic author Benjamin Radford claims that the group may have woken in a panic and had to cut their way out of the tent due to an avalanche covering the entrance, or because they were just scared that an avalanche was coming. This would explain why they were poorly clothed, as they were asleep, and ran to the woods for shelter, but it was in the dead of night, so they could easily become separated from each other. One group could have made a fire, which would explain the burned hands, while the others tried to return to the tent for their clothing, but they all froze to death before they could do so. At some point, their clothes could have been recovered or swapped from the dead, but the 4 bodies that were later discovered could have been caught in an avalanche and buried by snow, which would have been enough force, as the experts claimed, to have given them the injuries. And the missing tongue and such could have been the work of wild animals. This may sound plausible, but there are a few things that go against it. The location didn't have any signs of an avalanche taking place. There would have been debris or some kind of signs that it happened. The first bodies were only covered with a very shallow layer of snow, and more of the corpses would have been swept away, providing them with much more serious injuries, and definitely would have damaged the tree in the process. Furthermore, over 100 trips were taken to the exact same region since it happened, and not one of them ever experienced conditions that could have possibly caused an avalanche. Scientific studies also concluded that the area's terrain just made it nearly impossible for an avalanche to have taken place. But even if it did happen, based on the terrain's slopes, it would have completely missed the tent anyway. The two leaders, Dyatlov and Alexander Zolotaryov, were both experienced skiers, both with master's certificates, and neither man would have camped anywhere near a potential avalanche either, and their footprints that were discovered just didn't match those made by people running in a mass panic. It was concluded that they were walking at a completely normal pace. Another theory by Donny Eicher is that it's possible that wind around the Ural mountain created a Kármán vortex streak, which is a repeating pattern of swirling vortices, which would produce a low frequency sound called an infrasound. This sound is lower than 20 Hz or cycles per second, lower than the average normal human hearing, and it's possible to cause panic attacks within human beings. It could have caused some mental distress in the hikers, causing them to flee and go down the slope. But after leaving the infrasound's path, they would have regained their composure, but due to the night's darkness would be unable to return to the tent. And their injuries did match victims who may have stumbled over the ledge of the ravine in the darkness and hit some rocks at the bottom. The third theory is that the campsite may have just been in the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise. It's believed that the hikers were awoken by some loud explosions and fled the tent in a panic without their shoes and were unable to return in the night. After some of them froze to death, others stole their clothing but were then injured by more parachute mine concussions. There is enough evidence to show that parachute mines were being tested by the Soviet military in the area around the time the hikers were there. The mines detonate while still in the air rather than upon striking the ground, and they do produce injuries similar to those found on the victims. This also coincides with the previous sightings of glowing orange orbs in the sky around the area of the hikers. This could have been military aircrafts or descending parachute mines, and this theory also gives wild animals as the explanation for the missing body parts, while others believe there was foul play as the autopsy showed there were liver mortis markings and the bodies were manipulated unnaturally. Furthermore, the tent was actually put up incorrectly, something the experienced hikers were unlikely to have done. Another similar theory is that they were testing radiological weapons, but this would have affected all of the hikers and equipment and not just some of it. Though because the group's disappearance wasn't immediately reported, many believe the Soviet authorities covered the entire thing up. The facts are, 6 of the 9 hikers died from hypothermia, but another theory is that hypothermia can sometimes induce what's called paradoxical undressing. This gives the subject a sense of overheating, which would explain why they would remove their clothing, though others obviously had enough of a sound mind to try to add layers, stealing clothes from the others who may have already died. Another theory is that the group was killed by a menk, which is a forest spirit of Khanty mythology, while others believe it was just a yeti. It is believed that the injuries were so intense it could have only been done by a creature with superhuman strength. Strangely, 2 members of the search party who got to the scene first did claim they saw footprints larger than a human's, and these were never included in the official report but claimed the Soviet military covered it up. So what could have possibly happened on that day to take 9 lives from their loved ones? Was it a tragic natural disaster that wiped them all away? Was there a scientific explanation to their behaviour and what the search party discovered? Could the Soviet Union just been covering their tracks? Or was there some kind of supernatural beast on a rampage? For now, the story of the 9 hikers in the Ural Mountains continues to baffle, and we are still seeking answers.